order. And welcome to the first evidence session for the Pensioner Poverty Inquiry, and I'm delighted to welcome our guests today. We have Carole Emmerson, Daniella Silcock, Carole Easton and Peter Matejic. And Carole, can you just introduce yourself and we'll go down the line?
Yep, sure. My name's Carole Emmerson. I'm Deputy Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I'm also one of the three people leading our current pensions review. I should probably add I'm a member of the Social Security Advisory Committee, but I'm here 100% in my capacity as Deputy Director at IFS.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniella Silcock. I'm an independent researcher, Director of Daniella Silcock Pensions Research. I have about 20 years' experience of pensions and policy research. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Carole Easton and I'm Chief Executive of the Centre for Ageing Better.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Matejic. I'm Chief Analyst of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, focusing on poverty.
Welcome to you all, and I'm going to kick off if I may. Could you tell us what was led to the fall in pensioner poverty from the late 1990s, and again what related to the increase in pensioner poverty since 2013? And we'll go on from there if that's okay. Who wants to kick off?
So pensioner poverty in the UK, if you go back many decades, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, was really, really very, very high. There's been big successes since then in both, I think, better operation of the private pension system and better operation of the state pension system. Since the mid-90s and the early 2000s, I think the increase in support provided through means-tested benefits, in particular the introduction of pension credit, was a big part of that. Pensioner poverty fell. We reached a level where pensioner poverty is now lower than it is amongst the working age population, so a pensioner is less likely to be in poverty than a working age adult or a child. So that's a big success. Over the last decade, there's been a slight rise in pensioner poverty. I think part of that is because of employment growth. So while earnings growth has been pretty terrible since the Great Recession, there has been a lot of employment growth in the UK. That's benefited the working age population, of less benefit to the pensioner population. And secondly, I'd point to the fact that the pensioner poverty rise is really amongst those in rented accommodation. And so in particular, you're seeing people in the private rented sector and the social rented sector being increasingly more likely to be in poverty than they were in around 2010.
Thank you. You've answered the question really in terms of how it compares to other cohorts. So you're saying that proportionately pensions are less likely to be in poverty than children and working age adults. Is that correct? What about disabled people? Well,
disabled people is a bit more complicated because, of course, it's hard to know. You're comparing the income of households. Yes. The needs of those households for people with disabilities may be different. Mm-hmm. Do we know that disabled people look like they have higher levels of poverty? They clearly have other challenges as well as the household income. I think it's a much more complicated picture.
Okay. And what about in terms of indicators, in terms of what we focus on to understand what's happening in pensioner poverty? How do these compare with metrics, for example, around child poverty?
Others may be better.
I've got that here. And just to say, all of the stats that I'm quoting are after housing costs, which makes the most sense because obviously people might have high housing costs. So we've got 20% of working age adults in relative poverty and 17% in absolute, and then 30% of children in relative poverty and 25% of children in absolute. Also, just to say on pensioners, while pensioners as a whole may have lower rates of poverty, we're still seeing much higher rates of poverty distributionally among older pensioners, among women, among disabled people and carers, so and ethnic minorities. So there is still quite a few worrying cohorts, particularly those who are claiming state pension under the old system pre-2016, where they're getting a basic state pension and then top-ups from the earnings-related element. So because pensioners are a group that span 20, 30 years, we can't really group them together necessarily in terms of comparisons.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add something?
Yes,
I would agree with Daniella that there's a huge risk of talking about pensioners as if it was one group. We would not talk about any other age group in that way. So we must allow for the diversity. And the fact that we know now that the numbers of people over 65 in poverty is growing, and it is a trend that's set to increase because the people most likely to be in poverty are aged 60 to 64. So very shortly they will be pensioners. And that's why I'm delighted you're running this inquiry, because that number is set to grow as the impact of what's happening to people just this side of pension age as they move into pensions. And I would add to that the group of people who are not working at the moment, so looking at economic inactivity. And because the demographic trends that we're seeing in this country of growing numbers of older people, of more people living alone, of housing costs. In fact, although the number of people renting, and that is, as you say, a burden on future, potentially on future poverty, but also even people in owner-occupied who will have mortgages later in life because they will have started later in life. So the trends are really worrying, and that's why we need to be looking at the impact before and post pension age.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to add?
Yeah, that's something just on the kind of trends between child and pension poverty, which are both up over the last decade. So it sounds small, like a 3 percentage point increase, but if you look at a consistent group of 65 and overs, that's equates to 700,000 more pensioners in poverty than a decade ago. Obviously, there's an ageing population, but that's still 700,000 people who are below the poverty line. And other metrics agree, really. So we have something called the Social Metrics Commission measure, which has gone up as well. Yeah. And also the number of pensioners below our minimum income standard that we work with Loughborough to calculate, which has the cost of living factored in. That's gone up even faster. So, yeah, there definitely is a growing problem. And as Carole says, it could be growing in the future as well.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Steve Darling.
Thank you. And you've already started to pick some of this apart for us, so it's really getting more of the detail of which groups of pensioners do find themselves in poverty. Is it, in my constituency of Torbay, we've got a particularly higher number of 80-year-olds, which is more where the country is going to be in a few years' time. Also, I'm very much too alive to the fact that quite often when pension companies are reflecting on what your pension income and you require, they don't necessarily factor in the cost of housing, when we had some evidence the other week from pension companies. And yet, if you're renting a property, in the private sector particularly, that can be a significant cost of your household costs. So I'm wondering if you can unpick and explore that a little bit more for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with Daniella that those who reached the state pension age before 2016 faced a state pension system which had a smaller flat rate component than the one since 2016. And actually, if you're in receipt of a full new state pension on your own and you've got no housing costs, you are actually above the poverty line. So older pensioners who weren't able to receive that are clearly more at risk of being in poverty. Another way of getting yourself into poverty is not be receiving a full state pension, being on a low income, being entitled to pension credit but not taking it up. We know that pension credit take-up is nowhere near complete. And I think the private rented sector is a big issue in the sense that if you're receiving that full new state pension as a new pensioner, but you're in private rented accommodation, there are many parts, in particular in the south of England, where you'll find pensioners living and finding their housing benefits not covering their full rent, and that's what's essentially leaving their after housing cost income below the standard poverty line.
Can I come in as well? Thanks. So I think there's a few sort of demographic groups that it's important to look at. So women, and particularly single women, and this ties in with older pensioners. So women obviously live longer than men, are more likely to be single when they're older. Particularly women today, not necessarily as much in the future, are more likely to have much lower levels of pension entitlement than their male partners. So if there is bereavement or divorce, they may end up on a much much lower income. And then, as I said, and as Carole also said, being under the state pension system previous to 2016. So just to give you some figures for this, so the current new state pension level is £221.20 a week, and then the basic state pension is £169.50 a week. And why this matters is because the full new state pension is triple locked, so goes up by that lock every year, whereas the basic state pension goes up by the triple lock, but then any additional amount pensioners have from additional earnings related state pension or S2P will only go up by CPI. So they're seeing a larger portion of their income eroding. I also wanted to mention ethnic minorities. So while we've got 16% of white pensioners in poverty in 2022, we've got 33% of Asian or Asian British pensioners and 30% of black or black British pensioners, and then renters again. And I just had some figures for this. So it's considered that as long as you're spending 30% or less of your income on rent, then that is affordable. Average private sector rental at the moment in the UK is around 34% of average income. And then when we look in London, it's much more stark. So average private sector rent in London is £2,172 compared to the average for England, which is £1,100. So we're seeing clusters of pensioners in the private rental sector or younger people who will be pensioners, particularly in London, who will be struggling in the future.
Could I add a couple of things? I mean, I agree completely with everything Daniella said, and I think there are geographical variations, and although London and South East is supposed to be considered one of the most affluent, in fact, the rates of poverty are amongst the highest, and that could well be to do with property costs. And as much as the incidence in private rented is often higher and the demand on people may be perceived as being higher, we know that actually of 1.9 million people in poverty, 1.2 may be owner-occupied. So even if you own your own home, doesn't protect you necessarily from living in levels of poverty. I don't think we've mentioned carers. Again, a group very vulnerable to particularly intersecting with women who are more likely to be carers. And then people who, again, to bring it back to the kind of prevention agenda, because that's so important that we don't just keep adding people to this group. And that's why any review of this needs to start before 65, 66, 67, are people who've fallen out of work due to ill health or other reasons before pension age, because then they're starting at a huge disadvantage even before drawing their pensions.
The only other group I'd highlight, because everybody's, I think, got most of them, but I think just the importance of having a private pension income. So basically over a third of pensioners who don't have a private pension income are in poverty, and 10% of pensioners who have a private pension income are in poverty. So the importance of things like auto-enrolment is critical as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
David Pinto-Duchinsky.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. That was incredibly elucidating. I think, provides a really, really clear segue to the questions I'd want to ask, building very much on Steve's questions. I mean, it sounds, listening to you, like there are a series of underlying drivers for pensioner poverty. It sounds like the headline is, broadly, it's not quite, but, summarising roughly half of the level of child poverty. However, there are pockets, and it sounds like the problems you've identified, there's a kind of housing problem, there's a London problem, there's a carers problem, and there's a kind of pre-retirement problem, which is driving a lot of the people coming in with inadequate provision, either because they don't have a private pension or because their incomes fell long before they hit pensionable age. From your standpoint, sorry, I was just trying to summarise back. Are there any other big drivers you see? Because I suppose the kind of big question is, if this is the pattern, what's really driving it underneath it? It sounds like housing is a really key part of it. But what are the big drivers you'd identify? Because obviously that then goes to, so if you want to address this, what are the levers you're trying to pull?
I think there's a upcoming issue, which is that we're seeing higher levels of economic inactivity preceding pension age, state pension age. We're also seeing more people accessing their private pension savings. So those people are likely to be reaching retirement with less in private pension savings than they would have if they'd worked. And that's because we're seeing the state pension age go up, we're seeing higher levels of caring, and obviously as state pension age goes up, there are more people with health problems. And then we're not really seeing a means-tested benefit system that works with those people. So we've still got work-first assumptions in the working age benefits that mean that they're relatively low and punitive levels of benefits before state pension age, even for those who can't work because of health or caring, which means that they then sort of feed into a lower level of income once you reach retirement. And then that also plays into the fact that we've got a sort of owner-occupier assumption in the benefit system. So a lot of the benefits are designed so that you don't have any housing costs. So you can get state pension and pension credit, not apply for housing benefit and have an income of a certain level. But if you end up having to apply for, say, housing benefits above the state pension level in retirement and you have private pension saving, that will be eroded in the means test. So I think part of the issue is people's behaviour has changed, but also the way that the system interacts with people in terms of benefits hasn't really caught up.
I think on the housing issue, I think I'd be clear that Carole's completely right. The most pensioners who are in poverty are in owner-occupied housing. That's because the vast majority of pensioners own their own homes. Renters are more likely to be in poverty, but they're a smaller group. But I think policymakers need to worry about this because the proportion of pensioners or new pensioners who are renting is growing pretty quickly. So it's still going to be a minority of pensioners, but it's going up quite a lot. We've been used to a world where being in the private rented sector was pretty uncommon as a pensioner, and that's going to become an increasing group in society that we need to make sure that we're supporting. More generally, I think when you see someone in retirement who's poor, I think you need to think about, well, is this because they didn't used to be poor, and therefore perhaps part of the solution could be, should they have transferred, could we have done more to help them transfer their resources from working life to retirement, so help them make better savings decisions. But some of them will have always have been poor, and there are many working age poor people, hence poverty rates amongst working age families are higher. So I think we need to, for that group, we need to be careful, because I don't think transferring more money from when they were working and poor to when they're retired and poor would actually make them better off. Actually, they may well, in some cases, have a better standard of living in retirement, even though they're in poverty, than they had in their working life. So if you want to help them, you need to think about things that will boost their lifetime incomes in some way, either by making them more productive, helping them work, or by just redistributing more towards them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And on the pension side, it is sort of just managing that pension over the life course once you're working, and also people sort of underestimate their likely years of retirement, so can quite often sort of run it down too quickly. I suppose the other point, which is sort of on the counter, is that we are seeing sort of falling life expectancy and falling healthy life expectancy. So again, that's a worry for older pensioners as well. And I suppose the other thing about pensioner poverty levels, you're exactly right that it is lower than about half the rate of child poverty. But once you're in poverty as a pensioner, you're more likely to stay there because your incomes are much flatter. So it is still a kind of persistent problem as well.
Yeah. If I could just add, exactly right. There is prospect when you're a child, and an opportunity that things might change, and for pensioners in terms of their costs go up, their incomes don't go up to match. We're looking at, for example, heating costs and fuel costs. Recently there's been a lot of conversation about that, and also that the combination of pension, even state pension and pension credit, doesn't take you to the minimum income standard in this country as defined by Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So the rates are low. The system is hugely complex. The poorer you are, the more complex it is. I myself recently tried to apply for pension credit just to see how it goes. I failed miserably, but that is because it is complicated. The numbers of people being turned away, we're hearing, are very high now. So I think there's things that can be done, as my colleagues have said, post-retirement and pre-retirement as well, to enable people to enter retirement in a better position than we're seeing at the moment. The inequalities are stark, and I think we have to remember that. And that comparison with children, or the talk about the triple lock, feeds the kind of narrative, I'm sure not around this table, that somehow anyone over the age of 65 is living in level of comfort and wealth, which we know is very far from the truth for at least 2 million plus people over retirement age. And we're talking about differences that then impact on health. Healthy living expectancy gap in this country is 20 years. It's completely shocking. And life expectancy, 10 years. And people are dying in fuel poverty, literally dying, according to Marie Curie, in their tens of thousands.
And could I just therefore ask a follow-up question? This is incredibly helpful, thank you, and it kind of reinforces the extent to which a lot of this is about lifetime income and prospects pre-retirement, although I absolutely take your point, Carole, about some people being consistently throughout, and B, about housing and the interaction with that. So what capacity do we then have to predict how likely people are to be poor in old age? Because it sounds like from what you're saying, we should have a pretty good grasp of that.
I think there's a few indicators. So we've all been talking about lifetime income. Labour market behaviour or patterns during working life will be a huge predictor. And we can look at where people live, whether they're female, what their ethnicity is, whether they're disabled or a carer, and start to determine whether or not they will be disadvantaged in the labour market in two ways. So they might not be eligible for automatic enrolment, or they might just not work very much, or work very much in an employed role, so might not save very much. So then I said also, yes, we actually, sorry, not we, I don't work at the PPI anymore. The Pensions Policy Institute does an underpensioned index, which is actually really helpful for looking at people who are disadvantaged in the labour market and who are likely to have lower pension outcomes. And it does list all of these people, so women, ethnic minorities, carers, disabled people, and then the self-employed. Then particularly when you break down, so you need to break down into different ethnic groups. So for example, in working age, Pakistani and Bangladeshi households are more than 50% likely to be in poverty. So there's huge differences within ethnicity. We've said housing a lot, I know, housing tenure in working life. Household composition, both in working life and in retirement, just to say 25% of single pensioners are in relative poverty compared to 14%. And then people who claim benefits in working life. So there's quite a lot of indicators during working life that we can say, yes, this person is more likely to be in poverty in retirement.
Okay, over to John Mill now.
Thank you. Do you think that governments over the years have been able to lay out a clear vision, rationale for what they're actually trying to achieve with the pension, the state pension? And to frame that question a bit more closely, there's a big argument between whether pension, we should base it on adequacy, as in does it actually meet the basket of needs, or on sustainability, as in what's the prospect of the government actually being able to afford it, even if it's a good thing. It's the battle between those two.
I mean, there's actually a third possible agenda that one could have, which would be one about insurance and income replacement, which many Western European and Scandinavian countries say, where essentially if you earn more, you will pay more in tax and you will receive a more generous state pension. I think governments in the UK have been pretty clear for quite a while that that's not something we want. The move away from the state earnings-related pension scheme through the 80s, 90s and 2000s was pretty rapid. So I think there's pretty much a consensus in the UK that we've got to a system where people reach state pension age and if they've spent enough years in the UK, essentially will receive a flat rate state pension, regardless of how much was paid in. I think there's a nice simplicity about that system. It means that we just have to make decisions about what level should that be set at and at what age should it come in. And obviously the age has been rising with the state pension age increases, and that's a coherent response when people are living longer at older ages, and it's one way of managing the sustainability. In terms of the level, it's pretty clear that people will disagree about what the right level should be. I would point out it's currently at 30% of full-time median earnings, which is higher than any flat rate state pension has been in the UK in its history. So the introduction of the new state pension, which was more generous than the basic state pension, and the triple lock has been sufficient to unwind the decline in the generosity of the basic state pension relative to earnings that occurred during the 80s, 90s and 2000s, through that period when it was price indexed and earnings grew. So we have, by UK historical standards, a flat rate pension that's set at a high level, but of course 30% of median earnings is not a level of income that many people are going to be very happy on when they retire. Even your median earner literally is getting a 30% replacement rate. That is not a very generous system. And obviously people may well disagree and think, well, should that be higher? Should it be 33? Should it be more than that? And I think there's plenty of space for disagreement on what that level should be. But I think the principle of having a flat rate system, one that's not means tested, one that isn't more generous to higher earners, is very simple. I think it could be well understood. I think it's got a lot to commend it, and a lot to commend it as a kind of basis on which people can make their private pension savings decisions. So hopefully people can understand, well, I've got this £220 a week coming. How much do I want to save to get on top of that? So I think there's many attractions to the UK system now.
Just looking back, so the Pension Commission, which reported in the early part of the century, which most of today's pension system is based around in terms of automatic enrolment and state pension, they said that what we should aim for is that the state pension provides around 30% of median earnings. But they then assumed that people would be saving enough to have a further 15% to 18% of median earnings provided through the sort of automatic enrolment default, and then would save extra on top of that to provide a further 15 to 18%. So this calculation meant that people would achieve about 60 to 66% of median earnings as income in retirement, which makes sense if you're looking at a 2/3 replacement rate, which is what you need roughly to have the same standard of living in retirement. Obviously, we're not saving that much, and the Pensions Commission predicted that a lot of people would save 2% above the 8% minimum. So that was stated by them. The government has said in a few different publications that they're looking for the state pension to provide 30%. There's also discussion of looking at total income and having the state pension provide 40% of total income and private pensions 60%. We're nowhere near a level where that's going to happen. I've actually seen different estimates of the level of earnings. I know the IFS say that the new state pension replaces 30% of national average earnings. The Pensions Policy Institute says 26%. And I think this has to do with whether you're looking at a mean or a median. I think it's really important that if we're developing a target that we are clear about how we're making that calculation. And this actually means that it's extra concerning that the pension review into adequacy has been delayed because we don't have an established target at the moment. So we need to figure out what we're aiming for, figure out how to get there, set a target, and then aim for that. Because without that, it's very difficult to do state pension policy. It's very, very difficult to do private pension policy. How can we make a decision about whether or not to maintain the triple lock when we don't know what we're aiming for?
Could I add that, as well as you mentioned, I think, Daniella, not delaying the adequacy review, I would like to see any major decisions about pension age, pension entitlement, delayed until there is a very thorough review of the implications of doing so. We saw when the pension age went up by 1 year a little while ago, 100,000 roughly more people pushed into poverty. So we know the risk is high of making changes without due consideration. So I would like to suggest that there be a thorough review of anything kind of pension related, both the mechanism, the targets, also the benefits associated, both pre-retirement and post-retirement. There's been a lot of talk about pension credit and the challenges for people receiving that. So to avoid even more people being pushed into poverty, a commitment to a review, at least in the new comprehensive spending review, I think would be perceived really well, and by older people themselves, people approaching older age, and by everyone representing them.
I'll say a few words on adequacy. So we calculate our minimum income standard, and the pension level is at 90% of that. But it's very hard to get to that extra 100% because actually, once you get any further earnings start to sort of be taken away through the benefit system and so forth. So you're sort of almost stuck at the 90% level for a lot of the extra incomes are just taken away from you. But I also would make the point that it's a really great part of the benefit system. This is like a minimum floor for pensioners, and there's not similar one for working age people, and the adequacy is a lot higher. It's just that I think that should be a key part of like the benefit system. But yeah, you just got to be very careful about these cliff edges in the system that stop people just before or a fair amount before adequacy, and it makes it very hard to actually then get to that level.
Thank you. Thanks so much, John. And we're going over to Amanda now.
Hiya, thank you. There's just a couple of points that actually I think relates to my question really. I wanted to sort of delve into adequacy across the age ranges of our pensioners and the regional disparities. But one of the things I think Daniella was saying was around particular poverty and elements of groupings of poverty with ethnicity, disability, caring responsibilities. And one of the things I sort of wanted to tease out is that this similar in working population too? Would that be a similar cohort? The other thing that has always been something that I've been concerned about, I sat on public health scrutiny for 5 years, and one of the things that's quite clear is people living with multi-morbidities earlier, and actually what impact is that having at the point at which people retire, because they retire poorlier, and what impact is that having on the younger pensioner population. So the question is really about adequacy, but looking at age, looking at the regional disparity and some of the things that Daniella's already spoken about.
I think the short answer is yes. We're seeing this mirrored in the working life population. We're seeing poorer people in the south, but in the north. But obviously it varies by different region. Ethnic minorities, women, disabled people, carers. I've talked about Pakistani and Bangladeshi households having more than 50% high poverty rates. One of the things that is quite concerning for us as researchers and policy people is that there's not enough granular data, particularly on ethnic minorities, particularly over state pension age, because once you start to look at an ethnic group in a certain region of a certain age, you come down to very, very small sample sizes. So I would love to have lots of amazing data to say, yes, that's correct, and this is why. I don't have all of that data. There's patchy bits out there. So I think if you can call for things, one of the things to call for would be more data, particularly on ethnic minorities in retirement.
I love data. I'm never going to complain with more data. I think I just wanted... You did indicate, though, in terms of regional disparity, that there was actually, we talked earlier that housing costs is far greater in the south, but on regional disparity, you mentioned north. So, is it variable? What does the picture look like across the regions from a pensioner poverty point of view?
Well, obviously, within each region, we will see variations. So people in the north might have lower housing costs, but they're also more likely to be in poverty already. So that actually comes back to labour market behaviour and patterns. So it's all sort of interacting. So when you look at rents, obviously that's slightly different from just looking at regional variations, and then you add on to that gender, ethnicity, caring and disability, and self-employment, which is interesting because it actually tends to go along with particular ethnic groups or, carers or people who have to work flexibly. So it's difficult to actually say these people are poor, these people aren't poor, because there's variation within each area. But yes, I suppose the rents and the region work conversely, because the rents are lower, but poverty is still high because it's just a poor area.
I think Northern Ireland and Scotland have amongst the lowest pensioner poverty rates in the southwest, according to the DWP statistics. So there's a country level difference as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Over to Frank McNally now.
Thanks very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I think we all welcome the value of the triple lock and the contribution that it's made to reducing poverty over the years. Carole, through yourself and the IFS, you have highlighted the uncertainty that the triple lock brings both to those in receipt of the state pension and obviously the challenges linked to public finances. So, given that cost, and the fact that it benefits all pensioners, I'm keen to get a sense from you if you still think the triple lock is the best mechanism to increase the state pension.
I think if you want the state pension to be higher, clearly the triple lock has a track record of having delivered that, and that might be one reason why you might like it. I would point to the fact that it only delivers it in periods of economic instability and periods when actually the government finances tend not to be in such a healthy state. So I think a better system would say if you think the state pension should be more generous than, say, the 30% of median earnings that it is at the moment, you should set a target for what it should be and a pathway to get to that target. Because the triple lock won't deliver increases in the state pension relative to average earnings if we get a stable growing economy again. It only does it in periods when, for example, earnings are falling in real terms. So I think that a good guarantee might look something like we will always increase the state pension at least in line with inflation. That's what we've done since at least 1975, so that makes sense. Over the longer term, we have a target for a level of earnings that we want it to be at, and we'll work towards getting there. If it goes above that level, we'll claw back those gains, but we'll be looking to increase it to that level and then hold at that level over time. I think that's the kind of model we should be aiming for.
Did you want to say something?
I did want to say something which is less about the mechanism rather than the communication. Whether the triple lock is fit for purpose, I think, in terms of the intentions that my colleague has mentioned, I think we would support. But unfortunately, the way it's communicated perpetuates what I would call ageist assumptions. Every time it's communicated, it's somehow that, again, our older people get preferential treatment compared to younger people in this country. And rather than the communication that even if you get, as a result of the triple lock, state pension and pension credit, that only still gives you less than minimum income standard as defined. So I would suggest that there is a different way of communicating it, and also support the idea that we really do need the data to support what's happening in those, in particularly the poorer groups, in terms of how reliant they are on state pension and pension credit, and that data of is there any other income at all or not. And that data, a lot of the data comes already from DWP, so it just requires, I think, further, granularity. But it concerns me greatly that every time we communicate about the triple lock, there's a kind of kickback on we care more about older people than younger people in this country, and that couldn't be. I know that's not what anyone intends.
I completely agree with Carole. I think this intergenerational divide is not helpful and should be discouraged. It's also it's worth looking at the history of the triple lock. So when Steve Webb, ex-pensions minister, was in Parliament, he said, we've implemented this because we've got higher state pension ages. People are no longer able to accrue an earnings entitlement, so let's give them a decent pension level. But there was never actually a target set. So this, and it's worth actually looking at what the triple lock has done. So the level of the state pension eroded in relation to earnings from 1979 when it was delinked from earnings. We have now brought it back up to the level of the basic state pension in 1979. So we can ask whether we're happy with that level or if we want more. But I think the real key is have a target for where we want it to be, and don't get rid of the triple lock until we've decided what that target is, because if you then determine a target, it will be harder to reinstate it. And I do wonder, I know it would be technically difficult, but is a percentage of median income actually a good target? Because we can see something like fewer pensioners are in poverty, but more pensioners are in material deprivation. So this isn't just about income compared to income. It's actually about what pensioners can afford. So should we be aiming for something like the minimum income standard for state pension, which is a standard developed to see actually what can pensioners afford, and can they afford to meet basic needs to have a decent standard of living? And then just to go back again to the adequacy review, that is what we were hoping would lead to a target. So without a target, I think it's quite dangerous to take away the triple lock, because then it's unlikely to be reinstated, and how do we then meet a new target?
The only thing I'd add is on Carole's point about adequacy and the relative adequacy. So I think there's a kind of temptation to say, well, it's better than the working age benefits, so it's adequate. But working age benefits are at destitution level, and this being slightly better than that is still not great.
Fair point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We're going to hand over to Damien Egan now.
Thank you, Chair. So we've received evidence that for most pensioners, the state pension is their main pension. And we've also had evidence around in a previous session about the impact of auto-enrolment and how that would change over time. I've kind of talked to these points. I'm trying to think of so what are the main financial risks, I guess, as we look ahead? Like housing tenure, age, geography. Are there others? And I was interested, it kind of builds on Carole, when you were talking around age, so we've got the evidence that for older pensioners, there's a higher level of poverty. Is there data around expenditure and how that changes as we age in retirement?
I think it's relative expenditure. We know that older people spend more time at home, so cost of living has impacted very badly, because if heating costs go up, energy costs. We also know that a lot of older people, particularly, are living in very poor quality homes, and again there's an intersection here. So not only is the cost of living of providing the energy to heat your home is more important because you're at home more, but you're more likely to be living in a poor quality home with drafts, with damp, with mould. And we know again that there's, in the region of 2 million people, older people, who are living in very, very poor quality homes, which is damaging their health. That creates a burden for the health service, it creates a burden for social care. So this is it's also looking at people in the round, if you like, and joining up when we're looking at pensions, also talking with housing, talking with the health service to say what else can be done, because it's not just about the pound signs money coming in, it's about quality of life. And there's a lot that could be done to reduce costs if people's homes were improved, for example, and that would improve their health and their quality of life. So it's one of the reasons why we've been pushing for kind of joined up strategy on ageing, and would love to see a commissioner in place as well to say, let's look in the round and not isolate one element, which is literally income, when, as Daniella has implied, how that income is used, the opportunity to even spend it if you're housebound. If that's a kind of way of answering. So I would love to see not only a kind of delay on the pension changes until we've done a more thorough review of everything related, but also on a kind of ageing strategy and how all the aspects of later life are being addressed, and that a commissioner could oversee that and join departments up, because it's to mutual benefit for different departments.
Makes a lot of sense. Are there any other risks that the panel see?
And so you asked about spending patterns. If you look at household spending through retirement on the same groups of pensioners, it actually looks remarkably flat. So the sort of story of I'm going to spend lots of money in the early part of my retirement and have less spending need later in retirement doesn't seem borne out in data, and could be quite a dangerous strategy if people thought that was going to be the case. It does look, after inflation, looks remarkably flat. In terms of risks, if you're thinking about younger people and how they might play through the system, risk of turning this into an entire pensions review, I guess for employees brought into through automatic enrolment, there's questions about are those automatic enrolment rates set at the right level, but I think there's a case for making them higher, but I would caution against blanket increases. I'd think very carefully about the struggles that working age people have with their disposable incomes, and many poor working age people. So I think carefully about how to target that. I'd then worry about the self-employed because there's no automatic enrolment for them. Their engagement with private pensions is a lot lower than what it was in the mid-90s. It's just collapsed. It's quite remarkable. So I'd worry about that group. And then I'd worry about the people who are opting out of automatic enrolment, employees who have chosen to get out of their scheme. If they're doing that for good reason, that's great. That's why we're not compelling people to say, if we've got automatic enrolment, you can choose to get out. But I might worry that some are getting out for reasons that we might be less comfortable with. So, for example, people from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds are much more likely to opt out of their pensions, and I think that does raise questions about whether the pension system's working well for them.
Do we know why?
Do we know why what exactly?
Or Pakistani and Bangladeshi?
It's because of labour market behaviour, so they're much more likely to be, I think it's Pakistani people are more likely to be self-employed. Both groups are more likely to work part-time or in flexible casual work. They may not be on the books. They may be, and this is partly because of discrimination as well as other issues around education and poverty. I just wanted to add a couple of points as well. I really agree with everything Carole and Carole said. The point about inflation is so important, and the fact that pensioners' spending does not increase at the same way as the rest of the population. It's worth knowing that the Office for National Statistics and UK Statistics Authority are currently producing a household cost index, which has a pensioner index, so actually shows how expenditure is increasing for pensioners, which is different from the standard CPI. It would be really good if at some point in the future we start to link pensioner benefits and pensioner incomes from pension schemes to that index. And I also just wanted to say one of the big issues that I'm not sure we've mentioned is that people aren't saving as much into defined benefit schemes anymore. Yeah. So people just have lower incomes reaching retirement anyway, and will do in future. Like, it's the next 20 years where we'll start to see those cohorts reaching retirement, and that's a significant issue.
The only group I'd add is ill health as well, and sort of that growth among the working age population and older people. I think that's something that I'm worried about as well.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to David Pinto-Dichinski.
Thank you. And look, again, I think it's a really helpful segue from Damien's excellent questions and the points that Amanda and Frank raised, because we've talked overall about kind of pensions adequacy, and it's really interesting. I'd like to just step back a second and look at means-tested benefits, but start with like the really big picture of how is our spending allocated against need. So you've painted a very particular picture of need. You know, we have a London problem, we have a pre-retirement low-income problem, we have a housing problem, but a lot of the benefits are universal, and etc. So how does the kind of, you know, and you mentioned also the in interaction with housing need. So how does kind of spend actually stack up against need? Does it target effectively?
Yeah, so I think I'd have, I think there's some areas where I have some concern with the current system. One, I think, is when we push up the state pension age, the state saves a lot of money because it's basically exposing people to a much less generous working age pension benefit system for longer, and to a bit more generous state pension system for less long. So I think I'd raise the question about what about those who are not in work before they get to their current state pension age and on a low income. And I think it's slightly remarkable we haven't done any mitigations with the increases in state pension age we've done already. So something we put out last week looked at the case of, you know, you could make universal credit a bit more generous, for example, in the year before you reach state pension age, noting that the basic level of kind of support for working age people, if you compare that to the basic level of support for pensioners, in 1988, the support for pensioners was about 30% higher, so 1.3 times that of a working age person. It's now 2.5 times, so it's 150% more generous. There's a huge cliff edge. So if you're out of work on a low income before state pension age, you're much more likely to be in poverty. I think there's concern there. For pensioners, I think there's things the government should be looking at around take-up of benefits. I think that really matters. But I think also returning to the housing question and the fact that pensioners spend more time at home, concerns about the private rented system, I think I'd point to the fact that if you're in a social rented system, you often get your rent paid in full. The state is supporting you more there. Unlike working age people in the social rented sector, you're not subject to what's been known as the bedroom tax. So you can have a second or even a third bedroom and there's no issue. In the private rented sector, if you're a pensioner, your entitlement to housing benefits based on a one bedroom accommodation. And I think there's a case for making that entitlement to a two bedroom accommodation. That would be saying, well, actually pensioners in the private rented sector, it would make them treated a bit more like those in the social rented sector. And it would also say, well, because pensioners spend more time at home, their housing's more important to them, and maybe we think it's reasonable that, for example, an adult child can come over and stay in a room of his or her own. So I think there's a case for looking at that as well.
Could I add to that real agreement around before retirement and people not in work? And again, it comes back to kind of cross-departmental interest, because the Get Britain Working paper that's been recently released, which is really important in terms of reducing unemployment and economic inactivity, doesn't have an age lens on it. And we know that half of the 3 million people who are economically inactive at the moment, due to long-term illness or disability, are between 50 and 65. So that's a big number of people. Getting many of those people back to work would benefit them in terms of their pension. It would also benefit the economy hugely. And what we've also know from our research is that there is a good proportion of those people who want to work, but ageist practice, challenges in terms of flexibility, caring responsibilities, health provision means it's not possible for them to go to work. So I think it's really important that we put in, and this isn't about spending more money necessarily, but putting an age lens on some of the laudable interventions that have been proposed in that paper, so that over 50s get the focus and response from employers that they need in order that they can stay in work longer and then accrue the benefits that Carole has just spoken about.
I suppose one separate point I'd make about pension credit is most pensioners in poverty aren't on pension credit. Only like 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 pensioners in poverty are on pension credit. So that ability to kind of target the poorer pensioners through the benefit system is quite limited with that benefit. And part of that is like for positive reasons, because of the rising state pension, because of rising private pension provision. But that makes it quite hard, and that's why it's important to get take-up, perhaps also important to try and bring housing benefit into pension credit system, because housing benefit take-up is slightly higher and you'd obviously get a bit of a boost there. But I do think that's quite an important point about pension credit, is that it is only topping up some of the pensioners in poverty. It's not that effective in terms of coverage for targeting.
Yes. Sorry, I was going to say, I think about 1 million eligible people aren't claiming pension credit. I just wanted to build on what Carole was saying as well. Such an excellent point. I think within the pensions world, we're looking more closely at looking at finances throughout working life and connecting those to retirement. There still seems to be a very big cut-off in terms of levers, motivating factors, rewards, penalties between working age benefits and retirement benefits, and that division is becoming less and less helpful. As Carole said, we're seeing more people out of work at older ages. We're seeing higher levels of in-work poverty, particularly for those coming up to pension age. So more cross-working between departments, and maybe a benefit system that actually doesn't necessarily see the change into retirement as a cliff edge, but actually looks at what needs to happen for transitions.
Thank you. Amy and Egan.
I really appreciate that emphasis on those few years before pension age, and actually it's a reminder for us to think of that when we're having this the pensioner poverty review, because also like adding in if you've been doing physical and manual work as well, just the body changes, so it's more difficult. I wanted to ask about housing benefit and kind of going out. We kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of thinking about pensioners in the whole and housing. Any thoughts around, so different countries. I'm thinking of in the US, for example, where they have these big like retirement style, almost like villages where people live in a type of housing. I was in local government before, and one of the things that we found was that people in supported living, and of course this is set against the backdrop where the government have got this massive housing target, and so how do older people fit within that? And for supported living, it's very difficult to make the finances work for people who weren't on housing benefit, actually, and for your owner occupiers and people who might have done right to buy, trying to free up housing. So any thoughts around kind of housing in the future, and how, given the biggest risk is around housing tenure, and that growth in the private rented sector, and of course that money going, a lot of that money going out in housing benefit is going then to private landlords as well. So like how do we, have you got thoughts about how we address that so there's a better future for the next generation of pensioners?
This is really a supply issue. So after Right to Buy, there was on and off intentions to replace the Right to Buy stock that was bought. It's never actually been replaced to the amount that it gets sold, and we also haven't been keeping up with demand. So every year we have less affordable housing than we had the year before, and that's really what's behind this. A lot of people are looking at ways of helping people to buy houses, but actually it's not so. House purchase is decreasing, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's decreasing from the natural level. We think there was more, the policy community, think there was actually a bubble led by Right to Buy and economic factors that meant people were buying more housing for a while. But if you look back earlier in the century, lower levels of home ownership are more natural. So it's not necessarily the right thing to do to try and help people to buy more houses, and that could distort the housing market. What we really need to look at is more affordable housing. Then we wouldn't have this problem with private rentals, and that would immediately address a lot of the issues that we're going to see coming up with the increase of pensioners in the private rental sector.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I can't comment particularly on housing benefit, but to say that there's some changes, for example, if we're going to build 1.5 million new homes, could we have 100% of them accessible, for example? Because that way they're more convenient for people with disability, they become more practical for people to age in. Is the transport system around going to be adequate so that people are not isolated in their own homes and they can still participate in their communities? So you can make environments age-friendly. We run a huge network of age-friendly communities in this country. They'll give you lots of good ideas about what can be done about housing as well. But accessibility is absolutely crucial, as well as quality of people's homes. So not just, as I touched on before, not just building new homes, affordable ones, but making the ones that we do have, the majority of which are already built, safe places in which to age, would reduce the costs of those homes as well, both on the individual and on the state. And then finally, I would say that we do need a review of, again, we have this very unfortunate narrative of older people living in, huge mansions, and if they'd only move out, then we'd sort an element of the housing supply. If any of you have tried to move house recently, you will know how challenging it is when you've got all your wits about you and people to advise you. If you're isolated, alone, navigating the system, let alone the cost of moving, let alone finding somewhere. We know there's hundreds of thousands of older people who would like to move. They cannot find anywhere to go to, and they cannot navigate the system to being able to do so. So it is broader again, in my view, than just the housing benefit argument.
Thank you. Just a couple of additional questions to make sure I've covered everything we've got here. So any specific comments that you would like to make on the delays in the pension review, particularly around the adequacy phase, and also in terms of the relative health of winter fuel payment and whether this is going to cause problems?
Well, on the pensions review, I think a pensions review is needed. I think Labour was right to put it in its manifesto that it was going to do one. The Pensions Commission did a great job, but that was 20 years ago, and much has changed since then in both the policy environment and the economic environment, and there's much to learn about how automatic enrolment has gone, how the state pension age increases have gone. So I think it's a review is overdue and is needed, and one should happen next year, and I still hope that it will. And indeed, that's why IFS has been trying to do its own one for the last couple of years. On the winter fuel payment, I think it's important to remember the context here. I mean, the winter fuel payment was set at £200 back in 2000. It then halved in real terms over the subsequent 23 years. Because successive governments just left it at £200, and then when it's taken away from those not on pension credit, there's lots and lots of coverage about the cut, but it was halved over that previous 23 period, and we shouldn't forget that. We should also remember it's 2 billion of state spending compared to 140 billion on state pensions. The state pension is much more important. Daniella talked about the fact the new state pension is £50 a week more generous than the basic state pension was. So that's £50 every week going in flat rate pension relative to the basic state pension. So I think it's important to remember that context. That said, I would say that if you want people, there's a case for targeting a winter fuel payment on those who need it most. If you're going to do that, you probably want to give more notice to make sure you can get people onto pension credit. So I think there would have been a case for doing it for at least a year's notice to get that landed safely. I also think that the more and more you land things on, if you get pension credit, then you get this extra thing. You create unfairness because it means that somebody who just gets pension credit gets all those extra things. Somebody who's still poor but just a bit better off and doesn't get pension credit doesn't get it. And the winter fuel payment is just another thing we've added to that list.
Thank you. Any very, very brief comments, if you wouldn't mind?
I think I've mentioned the adequacy review. I think we need to have the adequacy review and then decide how to deal with it, and you can't really set policy without it. Winter fuel payment, it seems like a blunt approach. We've talked a lot about the distribution of incomes and the fact that you might be just above the pension credit level but still in material deprivation. I know Age UK say winter fuel payment has a big difference in keeping pensioners out of poverty. So if we need to look at the winter fuel payment, maybe look at doing it in a way that isn't so blunt.
Thank you.
I would agree it's too quick, too soon, and that it should be reviewed, and also again, what we need is it's a sticking plaster for our poor quality housing crisis too. You could save £200 easily if people's homes were improved, and joined up approach to that, including DESNES, DWP, MHCLG, just to name two or three, could be a different way of addressing the issue.
Thank you. Peter?
Final point was just to make it clear that DWP should speed up the processing of the pension credit claims. So there's obviously been a big spike in people claiming, but there's quite a time for it to actually come through. Well, if you actually are successful in claiming, you're probably better off than the loss of the winter fuel payments in terms of the pension credit you're getting. But you need to get it as soon as you can.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Really, really appreciate it. Very, very interesting. Going to move on to the next panel now. Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself very, very quickly? Starting with Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Caroline Abrahams. I'm the Charity Director at Age UK.
Hi everyone, I'm Morgan Vine. I'm the Director of Policy and Influencing at Independent Age. We're a national charity who support older people in poverty.
I'm Jonathan Safir, the National Administration and Information Manager at the National Pensioners Convention.
And I'm Adam Stachura. I'm the Policy and Communications Director for Age Scotland.
Thank you. And I'm going to kick off. And I just wondered if you're able to clearly identify which pensioners are at risk of experiencing poverty and should be prioritised for support from existing data that we have. Who wants to kick off?
Yeah, I think to build on the session before, those groups are the groups that we probably all also identify. So single older people, women, private renters, a massive growing group. And to add to the session earlier, we did some research at Independent Age with a university that showed that private renting is going to treble by 2040 in later life. And that could double the pension rate in later life, the poverty rate in later life. So it could go from about 2 million, it is now, to about 4 million if policy change doesn't happen. So private renters are a big red flashing light that we need to be worried about. People from minoritised ethnic communities are at much higher risk of being in poverty in later life, and carers for all of the reasons that were mentioned in the previous session. So I think those groups are well known and lots of statistics available.
Thank you. And could you tell me, in terms of, again, we did hear from the first panel a little bit, but it's about you also reiterating these points, the sort of geographical areas where it may be, there may be particular issues?
I would say all over the place, actually. I mean, obviously, the age profile of the population varies from one area to another. But that doesn't always make a difference to the poverty rate amongst older people. So we know there is a smaller older population in London, but we also know a very significant number of older people in London are living in or around poverty. So, I mean, there are well-known areas such as the coastal areas where there are large populations of older people. In some parts of the country, obviously very poor, but all the areas that we know are socially excluded often contain significant numbers of older people who are also living in poverty.
Just to add, another area, places where manufacturing has declined massively, in those geographical locations, there's also older pensioner poverty.
I just suggest a slight extension on that was where there have been traditionally working class professions, whether it's also agriculture. We see a lot of this throughout the central belt of Scotland, people who have had nothing but the state pension and won't have, maybe over the age of 75 now, will never have had any kind of occupational pension scheme to dream of, but will be on the basic state pension at best.
There's also groups of private renters. If you look at the two census, you can see that older private renters have vacated towns and communities where they lived, and they've moved to deprived, often coastal and rural communities. And we did some analysis of where those places are, so we can share that with the committee.
Thank you, thanks so much. What does this mean particularly about targeting support for pensioners and poverty, though?
There's not much.
I agree.
The silence we've got there is there really, I don't think this is just unique to the UK government. I think we'll probably have the same position throughout the different governments across the UK. There aren't really any particularly strong pensioner poverty strategies, if anything. I think I look at Scotland, the last benefit uptake strategy is a good few years old and pretty thin when it comes to pensioners. But I think we're also looking at those people who are, as you said in the previous panel, just pre-state pension age, even the 5 or 10 years beforehand. We're looking at women in their late 50s, more likely to be in poverty than other kind of counterparts, and what the kind of future holds then. But there's probably, one side of A4 we might be able to pick up what the strategy is across the UK.
But it can be done because there are councils across this country doing an amazing job at targeting their communities that they know live in deprivation. We did a project with local councils talking to the ones who had managed to increase pension credit uptake in their communities. So strategies can happen because we know the groups who are most at risk, we know where they live, and we know the places they might visit. So strategies can be put in place, but I'd agree with Adam, there doesn't seem to be one at the moment for how we get social security to the right people.
Okay, thank you very much. Jill German.
Thank you. And just before I go on to my questions, really interesting what you say about coastal communities. I'm from a coastal community myself. The local authority has been quite proactive, which is great, but as you say, it's by no means uniform. Yeah. And the other point I'd make on that is that the pressure it places on local authorities with a high number of people who go to retire in that area. So slight segue there, but really interesting for you to make that point. I want to ask about the benefit system as it exists for older people, the role it takes in addressing current poverty levels and providing an adequate income in retirement. So I'm interested in your thoughts of how the coverage and levels of benefits for pensioners, how it exists at the moment, what we can do better, and also the idea of take-up and things about linking benefits. So, for example, housing benefit and pension credit, and the impact that that could have on both take-up and coverage of where there's need.
Okay, shall I start? There's about 4 questions there, I think. So shall I just pick up a bit of it? So the bit that I was thinking about really was that, and I guess we're seeing that with the recent change that the government's made, that if you successfully claim pension credit, then that does entitle you to a whole raft of other support, which people very much appreciate. So, you know, free TV licence if you're over 75, help with glasses and dental charges, both of which can be very significant, as we know, and, you know, various other bits and pieces as well. So all of that is great, but of course the problem is what happens if you don't get it, or if you're eligible and you're not claiming it. And we find ourselves now in the rather strange situation, I think, where somebody whose income on paper looks, you know, higher and they're not quite eligible for pension credit, actually ends up being worse off than somebody whose income was objectively lower, but is A, claims, B, gets it, and 3, you know, gets everything else as well. So the cliff edge is becoming an ever greater problem, I think, because obviously there are lots of older people who just miss out on the sort of gateway benefit that entitles you to other things. And obviously, I'm sure we'll come on to this, and I'm sure you talked about this with the last panel, you know, the fact that so many people don't claim is a big issue, and it isn't just about pension credit. The other one that is very typically not claimed is attendance allowance, which helps to compensate for the cost of disability, and it's really important for lots and lots of older people. But, you know, if somebody said to you, oh, you know, you might want to claim attendance allowance, it doesn't sound particularly like it's anything to do with anyone, does it? It's a rather odd title, and I think we just know loads of people don't get it.
Yeah, to build on that and to build on some of the information that was shared in the first panel, to put this into context about the new state pension and the basic state pension, there's about 8 million people on the basic. So it's not a small number, and that number's not going to drastically change for about 20, 30 years. So we do really need to worry about that group, and when we're talking about things like the triple lock, that group will not get the same amount that everyone is talking about. That's not the increase they're going to see. So I thought that was important to say. Also, with, you know, Caroline's rightly mentioned, there's so many things that can come out of a pension credit claim that people become entitled to, but often they have to tell people again. They don't just get it. No. So that feels like a really simple thing that could be addressed. So, for example, if you get pension credit, your council tax should pretty much become nothing. But you have to contact the council, tell them you're on pension credit, fill in the form. The fact that you get it, councils could just do it. And there's other things within that brief that could just be done and given to the person. It's a lot to go through a pension credit claim, let alone the complexity and the number of questions. Just doing it mentally is a lot for people. To make them do it again and again and again and tell so many other people that they are entitled to more and more, it's difficult for people. And to pick up on one of your points, there's real complexity to this system. So, for example, you could not be entitled to pension credit until you apply for carers allowance, which you will not receive because you're a pensioner. But when you apply for it, you get told you would have received it. So now your pension credit threshold goes up a bit, and now you can get pension credit. Now, our advice team tell people what order to apply for things in. But if you're just trying, you'd apply for pension credit, get rejected, that's that. But actually, you could get it for lots of different complex reasons. So to try and make the system simpler and to help people navigate, there's a lot that could be done to improve, I think.
I wouldn't disagree with anything that Morgan's just said. I would point out that when we're talking about the state pension and the figures that are being given, generally that's the maximum. Only 25% of people actually get that. So when it's reported in the media or it's in reports, the vast majority of people aren't receiving that in their pockets when it comes to them. Again, the difficulty of pension credit, applying for it, The number of questions, I think it's 243. Right. It's kind of just ridiculous. And on top of that, as Morgan's already said, you have to go from one to the next, applying in order to get what you're entitled to. And it's just a very complex system, and many older people don't engage with that. And also, they feel a stigma about applying for these things that they are entitled to. So there's a couple of things around messaging that we need to get right so that people don't feel that, but we also really need to simplify the system so that they get what they're entitled to.
There's some very good points there, and I think the piece on the who actually gets the full new state pension is really important, because we've been hearing with the removal of interfuel payment, well, you know, come the spring, there might be another £400 odd coming in the state pension. Well, actually, that's not in one lump sum. It doesn't compensate. And as to the point there, I was looking at the Scottish figures, 20% of Scottish pensioners will be on the full new state pension, 6 in 10 are on the basic state pension, 4 in 10 are on the new state pension, but only half of them get the full amount. So those figures we can use makes it feel as if there's something quite generous. But when you look back at the pension credit levels itself, it's pretty meagre in all reality. And I think even beyond that, we couldn't possibly suggest that somebody on £1,000 a month is well off and shouldn't be receiving some extra support to cope with the extraordinary financial challenges that we have in our society today. So I think these lines that we have, i.e. pension credit, is the kind of the only one that exists for pensioners, and it's an incredibly low level, which I don't think does enough justice to those who really need some extra support, because they are left in a void otherwise.
Thank you. If I could just follow up in particular for Caroline and Jonathan about the adequate income in retirement. I know that you've called for a longer term approach to this, and I wondered if you could give us some more detail of what you think that might look like, and what you would expect that approach to take into consideration and include.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is something also that Morgan will want to come in on, if that's all right, because you guys are doing loads of work on adequacy, I know. And I think it would be good to have an objective look at what actually people need to live well in retirement. And I think when researchers have had a go at that, not that long ago, I think something like 14,000 a year would allow someone to live decently, and obviously that is quite considerably above what people get at the moment if they're able to claim pension credit, or where the line actually is drawn. And I think, you know, there are different ways of doing it, but I think looking at what's, you know, a basic basket of goods and services that somebody ought to be entitled to look at now, or ought to be entitled to live on now, I think is a good way of doing it. And from that point of view, it's disappointing that the government has recently announced that it's not going to be bringing forward phase 2 of its pensions review that would have allowed the beginnings of getting into that. The other obvious way or time for looking at this is part of the spending review. But again, older people aren't listed as one of the priorities for that. So my understanding is there won't be any scrutiny of, and I think actually it would be good for everybody, good for the country and the taxpayer as well, to look at how money is being spent on older people across the piece. Because I think certainly our view at Age UK is, and I don't know, I can't speak for my colleagues, but interesting to see what they think, is that, you know, you could argue that that older people at the bottom of the income distribution are not getting enough. And it may be that some very affluent older people, very affluent people, period, regardless of age, might be able to afford to pay a bit more. So, but obviously the government has taken that off the table. That's not something they're going to look at. And I think that's a shame, given all the other context that we know about.
Yeah, I'd echo some of Caroline's thoughts on the review being delayed. The MPC has a policy that the state pension should be set at 70% of the national living wage. In 2024, that would be £280.28. In 2025, that would be £299.15 per week. We feel that would enable older people to live with dignity, respect, and be able to live a life, not just...
live well.
Yeah.
Morgan, I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, just to build on what Jonathan and Caroline have said, so we've been doing quite a lot of work on adequacy. And I know lots of you will be hearing this from your own constituents, but just to put this into context, we've been getting a lot more calls from people who aren't entitled to any social security. Yeah. Our advisors know that. Yeah. And these people are telling us things like they're washing in cold water They're not eating any hot food at all. They can't justify the cooker. Somebody the other day told us that they sit in a sleeping bag from 1 p.m. just to keep warm on their sofa. So just to put it into context, that's people who don't qualify for anything. So we don't think the lines are set at the right place anymore. And I'd agree with everything the first panel said as well, that taking a step back, where do people need to get to? And what role does the state play in getting them there? You know, we've all got personal responsibility. We can try and make sure we've got private pensions. We can try and make sure that we've got savings. But some people won't be in that situation. And for those people, how can the state support them to reach a level that means they can afford to put the cooker on and wash in warm water?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Amanda.
Hiya. We talked about pension credits take up, and you know the panel's already indicated the form's a bit long. Actually going through the process, you don't need to fill out all the questions. Do we have a responsibility to actually break down some of those barriers, and how do we do that? And obviously, what do we need to do to support an increase of pension credit claims? Morgan, you were talking about some local authorities have really taken that on board. What's been the difference that they've made, and how have they done that? I'd be really interested to delve down into that.
So I can share the full report with the committee, but some of the things local authorities shared with us was that they were literally doing phone calls and door knocking. They were targeting areas of their community by sending, if they had capacity, sending people into local libraries or areas where they know that people can congregate and those conversations can happen. There's also a lot to be said for local community-based organisations. Independent Age has a grants fund, and we grant fund local organisations who are trusted in their communities. And I think that can shift the dial, particularly with minoritised communities, for example, where there can be issues of trust. If it's a group of people that they know, that they've built a relationship with, they are more likely to say, I am struggling and I need a bit of help, and seek that support. So there are things like that. There's also things like some of the local authorities have taken approaches like attendance allowance first approach. So attendance allowance has much less stigma. It's a really important benefit. It can provide quite a decent amount of money if you qualify, and it's not means tested. So often that could be a gateway to starting a conversation, and then once you've built that relationship with with our advisors, with the advisors at Age Scotland and Age UK, you can then say, how about this? Now that you trust us, what about we could try these things? So it's sort of building that trust, which obviously does take time, but that's why I think charities and independent organisations are really important for that.
Can I just ask, in terms of, one of the things that came out in the previous panel, but it was not my question, is obviously pensioners who live with people of working age and what impact that is having, because universal credit takes on priority in terms of housing costs. How is that impacting pensioner poverty when they live with somebody of working age that's maybe caring for them, or how does that impact on overall pensioner poverty and take up of other benefits?
The only evidence we've got, and others might have different or more, is we know from conversations we've had with older people who live in multi-generational households, sometimes they feel more nervous to start a conversation with an organisation like ourselves because they're worried that their children will be upset, they're worried that they don't want to make them feel uncomfortable, and those conversations can be more difficult to have privately. So that's the only thing I can think of that we've done where we've heard things, but I don't know if others have anything on.
There's the whole mixed age couple phenomenon. I don't know if you were also thinking of that, where obviously you have one partner who is above state pension age, one who is lower. The government made a change a few years ago, which basically meant far less generosity to those sorts of households. So in those situations, those people can be in quite a lot of trouble. And I think because there's just not enough money, basically. And I think, we wouldn't be the only organisation who's been calling recently for another look at that policy to see if we could get to a better place for people. But can I just pick up a little bit on your first question as well, about what more we could be doing? Obviously, Adam will speak for Age Scotland, but both the Age UK's huge amounts of what we do nationally and locally is to support benefit take-up, for which we get no support from the government whatsoever, and never have done, by the way. So there's no funding for that at all, and our local Age UKs have to work really, really hard to get any kind of local funding for advice and information work. It's one of the sectors which has been very badly hit by public sector austerity over the last few years. But, you know, we think it's really important, and in a way the last few months have just, you know, if we didn't think it was important before the last few months, we certainly know it now. And so we've set new objectives for ourselves in our new strategy, which we're beginning, particularly to try and reach out more into those deprived areas where, as Morgan was rightly saying, you may have people who are less, you know, less keen to come forward. And on the form is, by, as I understand it, by welfare benefit standards, not particularly complex, but it is quite long. There are 243 boxes. You know, you or I would probably go whizzing through. We could miss large chunks of it and just go da-da-da-da-da. That just isn't in the capacity of most people. And I think the general view is that a lot of older people would need someone to help them with that. You can ring up the helpline and they'll do it for you, and they're great. But how do you get through? Because they're totally overwhelmed, particularly at the moment, as I'm sure you'd understand. And of course, we at Age UK will help as well. And I don't know if I didn't want to speak for Age Scotland, Adam, but much the same would apply for you, wouldn't it?
Well, very much so. I'll just very quickly the second question, a little bit on the first question, but we're supported by the Scottish Government with some funding every single year for our national helpline to help advise older people, their family and carers about social security, given the kind of good signposting and referrals into organisations that can help, and we're looking to develop that service further. There's also corporate partnerships as well, whether it's SGN or indeed the National Lottery Community Fund. They're helping to sort of fund advisors in our helpline to do this as part of our model, so we can help more people. And I think last year we were approaching £2 million extra for older Scots who are sort of missing out on the social security they're entitled to. That's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I'm going to give the Scottish context, that's what I've been digging into, but there'll be about £500 million every year in Scotland that goes underclaimed by pensioners. Not just pension credit, but attendance allowance, tax reduction, the full lot. But on the very first question I made was, we've got to think about digital exclusion as well. You're looking at things you have to go forward and do, and look, 25% of pensioners won't be online. More than a third of those who are online aren't very confident using it and don't meet the kind of main criteria for doing so safely. So to the point of like knocking on the doors and picking up the phone, you'll do it as politicians. You don't have your voters coming to you and telling you how you're going to go and vote. You've had to go out and knock on doors and find that yourself. So these mechanisms are wholly important. And for those who aren't confident, if English isn't their first language, if they have literacy challenges, if they don't no one else in their life to support them, and that associated stigma of saying, I am poor, then you're probably not going to come forward. So a much smarter approach to identify people who are most likely to be there. I know that our senior officials at DWP, who for many years have been doing a very interesting and good job, I think, on having an interest in doing that. I'm sure there's a lot more the department can do, but there are some smart thinking. Whether it's scaled is another question entirely.
Okay. Thank you. Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the back of Amanda's questions, Caroline, to you, I recently met with Tony Donovan of Age UK Leicestershire, and he was telling me about all the work that they do in Leicestershire to help recruit pensioners to the Winterfield payment, pension credit, those associated benefits. Now, he was saying to me he was really concerned about the budget with the national insurance increase. That's added £400,000 to their cost base, which means their ability to do that kind of work is going to reduce, which is also going to have an impact on those that are eligible. Have you got anything to say about that?
Well, that's absolutely right. And we've, my colleagues have recently done a survey of all our local Age UKs. About half of them responded, and we'll be publishing that just after Christmas, we think. And it won't come as a surprise, I think, to any of the committee members. You'll have heard this from lots of charities. That, of course, you know, we've been badly hit by the NICS changes, and that, of course, is because they particularly hit people who have large numbers of low-paid staff. So, you know, lots of charities, for example, if you run charity shops, of course, you use volunteers, but you also have low-paid staff, and also, sadly, people who work on advice lines don't get paid very much either. It's a problem for us. We've set ambitious targets for wanting to help more people nationally and locally to claim their benefits, but we're doing it now with another barrier in our way, which is the fact that there are definitely going to be financial challenges.
And what do we know about the use of the Winterfield payment in terms of how pensioners are using it?
Well, I think the evidence, and actually from the IFS some years ago, is that because it's called the winter fuel payment, most pensioners actually use it for winter fuel. And, you know, it has been, obviously it's never been a vast amount. And when you look at how big energy bills have now become over the last few years, but nonetheless, I think it has made a very distinctive difference for some people. And in particular, it's given them the confidence, I think, to run their heating during the winter. And in a way, that's one of the biggest worries that we certainly have at Age UK, is that we know that many older people are reluctant ever to go into debt, having grown up in a world in which debt was definitely something you didn't do. And so they take preemptive action to avoid that. So they ration their energy use very considerably, and they won't take a chance. And I think the extra bit of assurance and confidence, as well as the sheer money that the winter fuel payment gave lots of older people if they were on modest incomes, really did make a difference. And you can see that the apps, I mean, we've been contacted by literally hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Tens of thousands of people have been in touch with us explaining their own situations, and a tangible sense of anxiety, fear. You know, people who have cut everything that they could cut, rather as Morgan was saying, you know, can't think of any other cuts to make, and so are rationing their energy use. And you know, so far we've had a fairly mild winter in the south. It's not necessarily been all that clement further north or in Scotland, or indeed in Ireland, parts of Wales. So I think real worries about people living in colder parts of the UK, and also we're only just really hitting winter. So yeah, we are really, really worried by what we hear. And just to give you, you know, the one that sticks with me, the story that sticks with me, is the woman who got in touch with us to say that she was in her 80s, her husband is a bit older than her, he's dying. She knows they haven't got enough money to pay their fuel during the winter, but she's going to spend it now so that he doesn't die being cold. And she knows that will jeopardise her own well-being and her safety, but that was her choice. That's what she's decided to do. And I just think it's a shame that that's where we've ended up.
Does anyone else have anything to add?
I was just going to reaffirm what Caroline said. The vast majority of our members say we get the winter fuel payment, we spend it on fuel. We've had some sad cases where people have said, I'm just above pension credit, I've lost the winter fuel payment, I don't know what to do, how am I going to get through this winter? We also had a story about someone's uncle who was also in that scenario, started skipping meals, hasn't been putting the heating on, ended up in hospital with pneumonia. So these are real people with...
Yeah. The last panel, I think the quote was, the policy came in too quick, too soon. I mean, have you got anything to say about that? I mean, clearly before the election, none of the main parties mentioned this as a policy.
I would completely agree with that. It should have stayed in place until another option was put on the table for how it would be removed. The messaging around it was short, sudden. It left a lot of anxiety and fear for older people, and it was a bit of a shock for many.
May I just say a word about that? I mean, we essentially begged the government not to do this until at least the spring, and ideally not to do it at all. And I think the reason for that was because if there'd been more time, it would have allowed two things to happen. Firstly, it would have allowed all of us to do even more than we already do, and our organisations locally and nationally, to help people to claim their benefits. As it is, it's been such a rush. It's overwhelmed DWP. They've tried really hard. They brought new people in, but we know that the system wasn't built to adjust to a sudden upsurge of demand that wasn't otherwise expected. So it would have helped that. And I think some older people, if they'd known that they were going to have less money later on in the year, would have made some economies earlier on. They might have made some slightly different choices about how they spent their money, so they had a bit more on one side to help defray their bills. As it was, it all happened too late for either of those things really to happen. And I think that's why we've been so worried about what happens to people this winter, especially.
One of my frustrations is siloed thinking by government departments. So one department makes a decision which has an impact on another. What do you see as the impact of this on other departments, for example, healthcare or social care, in terms of the knock-on from that?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting point actually about that, and we're going to do some more work on this next year. We've just decided that the direction of travel within government policy, which we absolutely agree with, is to support more older people to live at home for longer. So fewer older people in hospital, we know why that's important, and also fewer people in care homes and in nursing homes, unless they absolutely have to be there. Most older people want to stay at home for longer. But what we're not seeing is that understanding then influencing other elements of government policy. Because if that's where you're going, and I think we'll see that in the NHS plan when it comes out as well, quite rightly, then you wouldn't do a change like the winter fuel payment, because basically if you want more older people to live at home for longer, often in quite bad health and dying, then let's keep them warm, and you've got to allow them to have the money to keep warm. And it applies to housing policy and lots of other policy as well. And of course, there is no mechanism for joining up policy on older people within government. There's no minister, there's no commissioner, there's no strategy, there's no cross-cutting unit of officials. So despite the best efforts, I think, often of officials in individual departments, there's no obvious way of joining these things up.
Can I just ask, sorry to interrupt, Peter, but can I just ask, how aware are pensioners now about the extra energy providers who are now providing support, a social tariff if you want, to pensioners such as the KCU? I was really worried about that. Yeah. That is a new thing over the last few weeks. So surely that would help that family, but how aware are pensioners that
some of the energy companies...
It's about 12 energy companies now instead of one.
Yes. Some of the energy companies are indeed doing more to help. Some of them are working with organisations like us as well. I'm sure some of my colleagues as well. And there are funds set aside. The main thing that most of them can do is to reschedule your debt. So the problem with that, they have got some grants to give as well, although they're not being all that public about that, I think. And you might argue that they could do more to perhaps advertise some of this. And of course, every energy company is different, so it's not like there's a single scheme. It's all a bit of a hodgepodge.
Do all Age UK offices know about that? I know.
Oh yeah, definitely, absolutely. And we are working with some of the energy companies. We're delighted to do that. We're really pleased with their support, which enables us to do more. It really makes a difference.
I didn't know, I have to say.
Okay.
But, Okay.
But that probably reflects the fact that it is a hodgepodge. It's not like there's one scheme. Different schemes are doing different things and working in different ways. So that's quite hard for people, I think, to kind of work out exactly what's there for them.
Back to Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Finally, from me, some of the panel mentioned that a lot of this support is in the community by charities, which you don't get government support for. What could government be doing to help you guys to help deliver some of these reforms that are needed, particularly around recruiting people to pension credit and the winter fuel payment?
If I start off on that, and obviously we've heard about Scotland where there is government support, so that's one thing that would be nice to see in England, I have to say. I think successive governments have colluded with the fact that lots of older people don't claim their benefits and haven't been that bothered about it, actually. I don't think anyone's done enough about it. And I think all the savings have been baked into the Treasury model, personally. And that's shameful when you realise what that actually means for individuals who are really struggling to kind of get through the week and make their money stretch long enough. So I think there's a lot more we could be doing. It is probably about assertive outreach. It's also about simplifying the system. But I suppose what we've learned over the last few months is that it's really hard to get every older person to claim the thing they are due. And so in an ideal world, we should be moving to a system where people are more easily identified as being potentially in need and are then given the money proactively without them having to do something about it. Because as I say, in a world in which you've now got very old people living at home, dying with dementia, with all kinds of issues, often or sometimes without family to help, expecting them to be able to make a proactive step to claim their due is probably asking too much. And I think we knew that at Age UK before what's happened over the last few months, but I think it's absolutely now obvious.
Just to come in on sort of the range of questions that you've asked, Caroline's right. If people had a bit more notice about winter fuel payment, the people that we support are often very good at managing their money. They've had to live on a small budget most of their lives often. Yeah. So they would have tried to make savings, but those savings would have been things like, I used to eat 2 hot meals a week, now I'll eat no hot meals a week. So just to put that into context, the savings aren't extravagances that they can cut back on. Also, most of the people that we all work with, if they're living on a low income, it's a fixed income. There is not any light on the horizon where they are suddenly going to have lots of money coming in. So people in the 80s and 90s, it's a very bleak situation. And the people that we speak to at the moment feel completely invisible. They feel like the decisions coming from government at the moment are making them feel like they're not being heard and that they're being lumped in a older people's bracket where all older people are affluent and wealthy and they feel completely voiceless. So I think that's important. Some of the decisions that people are making, we did some nationally representative polling. I don't want to throw too many stats at you, but for example, nearly half of older people who are going to lose the winter fuel payment said they're going to go to bed earlier to avoid heating their home. 15% of that group said they were already going to do that, but 30% said it's because of the winter fuel payment change. So people were having a dreadful time anyway. They couldn't afford to lose any money. The groups that our charity support are particularly groups on low income, and now they are losing this extra money. As Caroline said, some energy companies do have initiatives, but the warm home discount, you only get it if you're on pension credit. So yet again, the group who just miss out £2, £5 over the threshold, they get nothing from the energy companies. Every company's different. And it's the same in the water space. We're doing a lot on water bills at the moment. Every single water company has their own tariff. You live somewhere, you get 90% off. If you're on low income, you live somewhere else, you get £5 off. It's literally that different. So some consistency and government thinking about social tariffs in energy, water would be really helpful. Also just an income maximisation strategy. How can the government put in place something public that charities can support and older people can inform that says, right, we're going to tackle this, we're in it together and we're going to do something proactive. As far as I'm aware, there isn't a public strategy, unlike in Scotland where there is one. I know there's some problems with it, as Adam's flagged, but we don't have anything here. So the older people we support have nothing to look to say, oh, you are going to proactively do something. And then they're seeing the cuts come and it's feeling pretty brutal for them at the moment.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And we are now on to Steve.
Thank you. I just want to take a couple of steps backwards and reflect on what you were saying around attendance allowance and naming of that, and personal independence payment kind of is what it on the tin.
Yeah.
What reflections have Age UK or others given to what attendance allowance could be a more user-friendly name to it?
I don't think we've had that conversation. I'm sure we could. But I guess part of the problem with attendance allowance is what we've already talked about, which it has to be claimed.
Yeah.
And so it would help if we called it something else, but I don't think that in and of itself would revolutionise the take-up, because all the problems that are in the way of older people claiming pension credit are pretty much there for attendance allowance, except for the issue around stigma, which, as Morgan said, is probably less pronounced. But you've still got to take a proactive step as an older person. And actually, the problem with claiming attendance allowance, we sometimes find, is that absolutely understandably you have to list all the things you can't do, and because that's how it works, and that some older people find that really, really difficult to do. They don't want to face up to that. They don't want to acknowledge that. I know of people who've finally been persuaded to claim it, but who took a lot of persuasion because it was not where they wanted to be.
Scotland's got a good name.
Well, sorry, Scotland's been on this journey with devolution of attendance allowance, which sort of start in a pilot sense, and as of the spring next year, it will be rolled out entirely. It started off actually as disability assistance for older people, and then all of a sudden, in a flash of whatever, it became pension age disability payment. And so PADP is the description, because actually attendance allowance doesn't mean anything. Really, to people. Have you heard of this? No, maybe you have, but what does it do? I have no idea. So I think it's that Ronseal approach of kind of saying what it is on the tin. There is probably, to some degree, using the word disability or disabled in it still will carry some stigma with people about, well, actually, am I disabled? And although lots of people who have claimed attendance allowance, and we moved on to PADP, who maybe wouldn't identify themselves as disabled because their idea of what that is very different to what the actual intention of it is. So the words really do matter, but there has been some thinking. There have been public consultations on this already, and I really recommend DWP and UK Government to be looking at names to help people understand more about what's available to them and why it's important.
Thank you. Clearly, pension and independence payment wouldn't work. We've already got PIP, but and the other bit I just briefly on, because I know we're running out of time. You were talking. There's conversation around the hotspot around opportunities for social tariffs. What would be the solution for that world? Is it just clearly simplification? But any reflections from any of the panellists would be really helpful.
I'll start off and then I'm sure others will come in as well. I think the hodgepodge that I was referring to is more about the additional support that energy companies have on offer this year, which aren't really social tariffs, but they're additional support for people who are in trouble paying their bills, basically. Yeah. But I think we'd all agree a social tariff for energy would be fantastic. And, you know, the previous government got quite close to it, was really looking at it and then decided not to press ahead in the end. But ultimately, it would make an awful lot of sense, not only for older people, but for people of all ages who are, you know, who necessarily find it difficult to fund their energy costs, whether that was, you know, lone parents with children, disabled people, carers, all kinds of people. Where you draw the line about who's eligible, of course, is key, as is how you actually fund it. Because probably I imagine that I can't really see the Treasury wanting to fund it at the moment, which would therefore mean that the cost of it would go on everyone else's bills. So there are some trade-offs there, of course. But yeah, because I think maybe we haven't, I don't know if this was said in the previous session, but for older people, that energy bill has a particular resonance in a way I think that other bills don't, even though things like water bills have gone much more expensive than they ever used to be. But it's because of older people's dependence on energy to keep well and warm through the winter, and the fact that if they can't, and you feel the cold more anyway as you get older, that really is a serious problem for your health, and the sheer scale of the bill, and the fact it's gone, you know, that what's happened to prices over the last 4 years has gone so mad, really, that gives it a special resonance. So knowing that there was some certainty and some a national scheme around social tariff for energy, I think would be fantastic.
Thank you.
I would ask that it was also extended to other areas such as broadband, water, so that it's not just voluntary schemes offered by different companies, but that there's a set level where every company signs up to and people know what they can get.
And it would need to be carefully done because some companies, broadband, water, energy, go above and beyond. And they are doing really good stuff, and it's not just means tested. They give it support to people who are just above threshold. So it would have to be very carefully looked at so that people weren't losing anything. But I definitely would agree, like water, broadband and energy it would provide consistency for people so they know what's coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Over to Johanna Baxter.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about the change to the winter fuel payment. I'm just conscious that for a number of years before that change was announced, the payment was subject to a lot of criticism for being, sorry, my throat's gone today, for being quite a poorly targeted measure. So in 2016, there was a report on intergenerational fairness by the predecessor Work and Pensions Committee, who described it as a blunt instrument for alleviating fuel poverty and provided a cash payment to many households who did not need it. And the Resolution Foundation's report on cold comfort this year argued that it was poorly targeted as a measure of support with fuel costs. So I guess my question is, do you accept that there's, in principle, taking away the concerns about communications, but in principle that there is a case for better targeting help with energy costs, which is something other than the winter fuel payment?
Yeah, I can start with this one. So there's always a case for universal because there will always be people who need money who are not going to receive it the minute you start targeting and means testing. However, if you do want to do something like that with something like the winter fuel payment, to give yourselves longer than 3 months so that you can make sure that the 1 million people that we know need the money, they're the people the government have agreed need it, the million who don't get pension credit who are entitled to it, give all of us more time to get them that money, but also give more time to think about the thresholds. So if you want to means test the winter fuel payment, is an older person who might have £12,000 or £13,000 income a year, who could well be a private renter, is that the right threshold? That is incredibly low. Having a bit more time to think about where those thresholds are set and what they are, we think could have been really beneficial. The other thing is, one thing that we've been thinking about, so private renters have come up in both sessions, they're a hugely at-risk group. The government is clear, it knows that they're on low income, and if you get housing benefit, you are defined as on low income. You can't get it unless you're on low income. We've been saying there are about 380,000 older people who currently get housing benefit and they don't get pension credit. Some of them are entitled to pension credit and haven't applied. Some of them are not entitled because the thresholds are different. Yet they are all on low income. The government could identify those 380,000 people very quickly, very easily, give them winter fuel payment. Because the merger, which you mentioned, of housing benefit and pension credit, it has been sped up, which is really welcome. But I think it's still going to be a couple of years. Yeah. But we know that group are on low income, and the government knows it wants to target the people that need the money. So that would be one way that the government could slightly extend eligibility that would help people.
I was going to come on to what the government could do, but I mean, I'm assuming, given what you've said, because I understand the comments that are being made about timescales and thresholds, but just given the criticisms that have been levied at the winter fuel payment in the past, I mean, do you accept the principle that there must be a better way of targeting support to those who need it most?
I think that's really difficult with older people, because I think what we've found out over the last few months is that giving winter fuel payment to those who don't need it is the price we pay for getting it to those who really do need it. And there is no other way of getting that money to everybody who needs it unless you do a universal payment. So although I am by nature a pragmatist, and I totally accept that the public finances are in a really difficult place and the government has difficult choices to make, unfortunately the choice it's made has ended up making a lot of poor pensioners poorer. For all the reasons really that Morgan was explaining. Had the government decided to remove eligibility from higher rate taxpayers, we wouldn't have complained. And I think that where nobody much else would have either, actually. But that's not what they did. They did something much more dramatic. And as Morgan says, the line is simply too low. And far too many people who really need that money are not going to get it. That's the problem.
So,
if there's other fuel poverty measures that exist across the UK that don't work particularly well on their own, and even with the winter fuel payment, 40% of pensioners in Scotland are living in fuel poverty, a quarter are in extreme fuel poverty, and in 2 years that jumped from 11%. That universality, I think, is incredibly important, and from some of our insight research, 86% of pensioners that we spoke to took part in that said it was quite or very important to them. 55% they can't manage without it. 94% of those with incomes below £15,000 said that was really important to them. Two, it's been baked into the state pension system as well, and I think it's only been in the last 6 months we've been looking at them as two different things. It's for the last quarter of a century, this has essentially been part of the state pension system, and people have relied on this. It helps, as we said earlier on, through energy costs in the winter time. So there's probably more, as Caroline's saying, that you could do with removing some people at the very top. Has the opt-out of the winter fuel payment been successful? No. I think it was less than a dozen people opted out in Scotland 2 years ago. I think that's the last figures I got from DWP officials. So people could opt out. We've also removing the universality, we've now created a further stigma line for older people that and I see this all the time with news reports about asking an older person in the street, do you need the winter fuel payment? And of course they're not going to tell the public, yes, I need it. But actually it's been part of their finances, it's been part of their entitlement. It's not really in that same sense. So I think there's a really strong argument for that. And actually, are the richest people, of which there won't be proportionally huge numbers for pensioners, the kind of millionaires we talk of will be proportionally a handful compared to everyone else who really, really need this. So I think we've kind of really missed an important beat on this one and got it incredibly wrong.
It's interesting that the Scottish Government ended up making the same decision as the UK Government. They had also had advice suggesting that it was poorly targeted in Scotland. So it's interesting that both governments came to the same conclusion. But can I just look at... so obviously the Scottish Government have announced that they would be putting in place a mitigation for the winter of 24-25, but that's £100. That's quite a low level. So do you think they should be doing more if they're looking to mitigate, and if so, what do you think they should be looking at?
Yeah, on your sort of last part first, I think £100 is much better than it would have been, and we're really glad that they've listened to the sum of all the parts of the campaign to reinstate a universal element of a winter fuel payment or the pension age winter heating payment there. £100 in a year's time after going from zero is really not going to kind of touch the size on what's required. I think even if you got to £150, similar to what Northern Ireland has, it would only cost another, say, £35 million out of a nearly £60 billion budget, or even £22 billion for health and care. So there's more that can happen there, and we've really missed a timing moment of what else can happen this winter too. But I also think the Scottish Government came to the conclusion that it should be universal. You know, when this was removed, they had come to the conclusion after the consultation of the pension age winter heating payment that it should be universal. Now, whether or not that was actually because the payment of that was entirely going to come from Treasury to kind of do this, so Social Security Scotland would essentially just enact the same policies. There's not any new money, and whether or not there were lots of voices saying it should be better targeted, but they were, you know, Age Scotland were saying it should be universal for all the reasons I've mentioned, but there are fewer of us in the older people sector than there are everywhere else, and we're looking at real lives at the same point. So I think the Scottish Government came to that conclusion, universality, and if I'm really honest, I think that they spent a little bit too long not thinking about what they could do this winter if it had gone and it became a fait accompli. We can't possibly do anything more, and time was lost in having a really important intervention for this winter, because there'll be more people in hospital, more people eating fewer hot meals and all the rest of it.
No, I mean, I was going to come on to this winter because, you know, their announcement does only affect 24-25 onwards. What do you think both governments could be doing to support people with their fuel costs this winter?
Well, we've repeatedly asked for the money automatically to be given to some groups who are on other benefits. Carers allowance is one, for example. Housing benefit is another. There's attendance allowance. And of course, you would then give it to some people who wouldn't need it, particularly on attendance allowance, because although people who are disabled and older are much more likely to be in poverty, not all of them are. But again, that's the price you pay for getting it to the people who really need it. And the numbers of people who are going to miss out when they really do need it are so very significant. And despite the efforts of benefit take-up, they're not going to make enough of a difference. We're still looking at really significant numbers of older people who are going to struggle this winter. So that's why we've asked the government to do that. We've done that probably been asking for that for the last couple of months. And but clearly government is decided it doesn't want to do that. So I think we've just got our fingers crossed for what happens over the next few weeks and months.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. We've concluded our second panel for this first session of the Pensioner Poverty Inquiry.